Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lama Fakih. I'm the interim Deputy Executive Director for Human Rights Watch. And it's our pleasure to be here with you today to talk about what has been a historic and transitional period in Syria. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. First, I have Hadi Al Khatib. Hadi is the Managing Director of Mnemonic and also the founder of the Syrian Archive. And we're joined as well by my colleague Hiba Zayadin. Hiba is the Senior Syria Researcher at Human Rights Watch. And Nabieha Altaha. Nabieha is a Syrian freelance journalist based in northern Aleppo in Syria. And Nabieha is going to provide her comments in Arabic, and they will be translated by Lina Al-Hafiz. Lina is also a journalist and a filmmaker. Most of you will know that much of the conflict in Syria was marked by an inaccessibility for journalists and civil society members. Over the years of the conflict, it was increasingly difficult to access government-held areas of Syria. People were denied access, and those that were trying to operate inside of the country were subjected to a range of oppressive tactics. That quickly changed when the Assad government fell in December. But before we talk about that critical period in Syria, we want to take a step back and look at the reporting that was conducted during this period marked with inaccessibility. So Hiba, I'll start with you. Can you talk to us about the tactics that you used and other colleagues used at Human Rights Watch during that phase to try to overcome the access restrictions that we were subjected to in Syria?
Definitely. Is this working? Yes. Okay. So the last time Human Rights Watch has actually been to Syria, to government-held areas, was in 2013, when Lama was the Syria researcher at Human Rights Watch and went to Latakia to do an investigation into some of the abuses that were taking place as part of opposition forces' incursion into the Latakia countryside. Since then, and even a little before that, government-held areas have really been quite off-limits to us. We have been able to go to the northeast, we've been able to go to the northwest and to conduct investigations there, but government-held areas had become increasingly difficult for us to access physically. And also as international fatigue set in, it became that much harder to even do advocacy, to get any, to get impact on some of the work that we were doing in government-held areas. And so increasingly we had a heavy reliance on remote research, on cross-border research. So we were doing a lot of the work, a lot of the interviewing in Lebanon, in Jordan, in host countries, in Turkey, to be able to get to the investigations that we were aiming to do. But again, things got that much harder to get leverage. Obviously, the Syrian government would not, engage with us, would not respond to our letters. We usually, whenever we write reports, we offer the right to reply, we offer meetings, we request meetings and access. For the longest time, none of that was being afforded to us. And so we really started to have to look for, whatever niche angles we could really work on in the Syrian context, in government-held areas, wherever we could actually have impact. And over the last couple of years, that's really been humanitarian conditions, which we know have been deteriorating and continue to deteriorate today. And so we looked at the weaponization of aid, we looked at how we can influence donor states, refugee hosting states, in terms of humanitarian aid, humanitarian operations, UN agencies. Another big thing that we focused on was the conditions for refugees upon deportation to Syria. Again, that was very difficult work that took a lot of patience, a lot of planting seeds to be able to get people to trust us. Security risks had become incredibly high for people who would want to engage with us or who would want to be interviewed by us, and so we had to keep that in mind. We had to really gain trust slowly, make sure that we are protecting our sources to the best of our ability, And so it was incredibly difficult. And in the last 2-3 years, and that's when I took over the Syria file, things had really started to look quite hopeless and quite dismal. And you know, a month before the fall of the government, it really was at its bleakest. And, you know, but we continued to do the work. International justice efforts was a big thing for us, to try and push for justice outside of Syria in whatever context that we could. But yeah, things got really bleak and very difficult for us and for Syrian activists and for others to really stay motivated. And that's kind of, you know, what we were dealing with pre-fall of the government. And, you know, hopefully in the next couple of questions, we'll talk about how things changed almost overnight.
Thank you, Hiba. You know, during that period, we had to rely so much on being able to access people outside of the country, so people who took their stories with them, but also on evidence online and using open source research techniques to try to piece together the stories and the evidence of the violations that were taking place inside of the country. And Hadi, you and your colleagues played an integral role in helping to develop that open source capacity on Syria. You began your work with the Syrian Archive in 2014 to respond to this imperative of sifting through the evidence of violations that were taking place online. Can you talk to us about that period, about some of the challenges in starting up the Syrian Archive, and, you know, the critical role that Syrian Archive played throughout that period?
Absolutely. Thank you, Lama, and thank you everyone for being here with us today. It's great to be with you during this event. So in 2014, when we started the Syrian Archive, it was a few months after the use of chemical weapons in Eastern Ghouta, one of the biggest chemical weapons in modern history. It's also the time when the former president, US President Barack Obama, said that chemical weapon is the red line. But then after that, 200 incidents of chemical weapons were documented, and chemicals were used against civilians all over the country again. So 2014 was a very difficult situation for documentation efforts, for any justice efforts. Syrians at that time would say, why would it make sense to document? We're documenting for the sake of documentation, and that's really not the point. So what really we wanted to do is to make sure that we establish a way to use digital information published by journalists and citizen journalists and lawyers that were risking their lives during the last 14 years for reporting purposes, but also in a legal context. And that was not easy, because funding also was very limited to documentation efforts, especially when it comes to the use of publicly available information, and especially when very strong evidence, like the evidence leaked by Caesar files, the footage of torture of detainees, hasn't been used for accountability for years after, even though it was shown everywhere. So making sure that we raised the funding for that was the biggest challenge, and we managed to do that. But then the second thing was actually building a team, sustainable way to make sure that the team has the skills and trained to verify information from publicly available sources, and building the methodology and have access to the tools in order to do that. The other thing that was very challenging that we needed to work on is to make sure that we have the technical infrastructure in order to do the work. Syria is one of the most documented conflicts in modern history, with thousands of videos, millions of videos being published online. At the Syrian Archive, we archived over 6 million footage from Syria since 2011. So you can imagine the technical capacity that you need to have in order to preserve it for the long term, forensically, to make it available for the future, and in order to organize it and use it for different purposes. And we took a lot of time in order to build the tools, the archival tools, and the tools that we are able to use to organize this information and make sure that it has context and that it's usable. We wanted to build an archive that is usable, not just an archive for history. And the last thing that we also learned during this journey is to make sure that we also build the workflows, policies, and protocols and have all that in place in order for us to do the work in a smooth way. So all of this was kind of the ingredients of how we done this work from exile, and how we were able not just to contribute for reporting purposes, this information, but also to use it in a legal context. We contributed to a case against Bashar Assad and his brother and other senior officials that are all responsible about the case of chemical weapons that happened in Eastern Ghouta in August 2013. So an arrest warrant against him that hopefully is going to be validated in July of this year.
Thank you, Hadi. And of course, the work that was being done by investigators and journalists outside of the country was always being complemented by journalists still operating inside of Syria, including in government and non-government held areas. And Nabieha, you continue to operate inside of Syria throughout the hostilities. And you took the decision to travel with the forces as part of the operation to oust Bashar al-Assad. And during that 2-week operation, you traveled from northern Aleppo, finally arriving in Damascus, the first time that you actually were able to ever travel to Damascus. Tell us more about what that experience was like.
شكرا لما. أول شيء بدي أخبركم إنه أنا أول مرة بطلع برا سوريا. طبعا حياتي قبل كانت بشمال غرب سوريا. اليوم أول مرة رح أحكي عن سوريا لحدا من برا سوريا. حياتي بالبداية كانت كلها بشمال غرب سوريا. Okay.
So thank you everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. This is the first time I am able to speak about Syria outside of Syria. This is the first time I am able to travel abroad and tell our stories.
اليوم أنا كتير مبسوطة. أنا هون حتى أحكي عن سوريا، أحكي عن شمال غرب خاصة، أحكي عن الناس يلي بيعتبرونا نحن صوت إلهم، أحكي عن الأشخاص يلي ما قدروا يحكوا عن العالم معاناتهم. سوريا وخاصة شمال غرب سوريا تهجر إلها كل السوريين من كل المحافظات، بقعة جغرافية صغيرة احتوت كل السوريين.
So today I'm going to be talking about northwest Syria, and I'm honored and very pleased to be able to speak for the people who were not able to speak themselves and to be their voice. So the area of northwest Syria is the area to which Syrians from all over the country were displaced to. So it is very densely populated and by people that come from all regions of Syria.
الحرب والقصف، طيران، تهجير، المخيمات، انتهاك حقوق الإنسان من اعتقالات واختفاءات، هذا الشيء اللي كنا عايشينه بشمال غرب سوريا سابقا. هيك كانت حياتنا. سقط الأسد وحصلنا على حريتنا، ورح نبقى ندافع عن هاي الحرية من أي دولة وأي سلطة كانت.
So war, bombardment, air force detentions, even starvation, these were all the tools that were used against us. These were all things that we had to endure for many years there. Finally, Assad did collapse, and we did gain the liberty we demanded. We will continue to protect this liberty from any authority or any state that attempts to undermine it.
خلال السنوات الماضية فقدنا الزملاء، عدد كبير من الزملاء الصحفيين بسبب هن كانوا ضحايا لوحشية الأسد وداعمينه وحلفائه اللي كانوا هن عم يقتلوا السوريين. فقدنا الزميل أنس خربطلي مراسل وكالة الأنباء الألمانية، فقدنا الزميل مصطفى الساروت بسبب قنص من قبل قوات قسد. هدول الشباب كان عندهم حلم إنه بعد التهجير يوصلوا لبيوتهم، يوصلوا لعائلاتهم، يوصلوا لمناطقهم، يبقوا عم يوصلوا رسالتهم، لكن مع الأسف ما سمحوا لهم بهذا الشيء أو يكملوا المشوار اللي هن كانوا طالعين كرماله.
During these years, we have lost many colleagues and friends that were also working with us as journalists. Very recently, in the past 2 weeks, we lost our colleague Anas Kharbutli, who was working with the German news agency. He was killed in a shelling by the Assad Air Force. We also lost another colleague who is Mustafa Sarut, who was sniped by Assad forces in the past 2 weeks. He was targeted. They and many others were trying to go back home. They were hoping that they will finally be able to reach their towns, their villages, to meet their families again after years of displacement. That dream was taken away from them just a few days before it finally materialized. We will continue to do the work that they were trying to do. We will continue to communicate the voices that they were trying to reach out to the world.
خلال تغطيتي بالأسبوعين لتحرير سوريا وإسقاط الأسد كنت من الصحفيات الأوائل اللي دخلت محافظة تلي المحافظة من أول دقائق اللي تحررت فيه. كان صعب، عندي طفلة عمرها 3 سنوات تركتها بالبيت، كان في صعوبات، كان في قصف، كانت الألغام هي عطول بطريقنا، لكن حتى بقينا نايمين بالسيارة لأيام خلال الأسبوعين حتى نكون عم نوصل مباشر، حتى نحقق الحلم يلي نحن حلمنا فيه من 14 سنة.
During the coverage that I participated in the 2 weeks that led finally to the collapse of the Assad regime, it was an extremely dangerous situation. We were being bombarded, we were being targeted. There were landmines all around us in the road that we were taken. It was particularly challenging for me because I have a 3-year-old daughter that I had to leave behind and worry about not being able to go back to her. We had to sleep in the car. We had to find ways to charge our cameras and our tools, but we needed to be on the front line. We needed to be there every time an area was liberated. It was very dangerous and challenging, but we had to do it.
بالبداية وأول ما قررت أطلع غطي تحرير سوريا ما انسمح لي لأني فتاة صحفية، فكان صعب إنه أكون موجودة برأيهم طبعا، لكن ما قبلت بهذا الحكي وكملت. كان الموضوع سهل لأنه معي زوجي بكر القاسم، هو كمان صحفي سوري، فكان الموضوع أسهل إنه أكون متواجدة معه عم نغطي تحرير سوريا منطقة. قدرت أكسر الحواجز وكملت التغطية.
It was very challenging also because at first I was not permitted to join the front lines because I am a female journalist. But I did not accept this and I pushed my way through. It helped the fact that my husband, Bakr al-Qasim, is also a Syrian photojournalist and he was also covering on the front line. So I just went along with him and I ignored whatever instructions I was given against that. So I was able to continue following events on the front line and being there step by step.
الحلم يلي نحن كنا عم نحلمه، يلي أنا من صغيرة كان أبي يحكي لي عنه، عشت لحظة بلحظة مع انهيار نظام الأسد. بلحظة دخولي لدمشق كنت عم سجل فويس لبابا، عم قل له بابا سقط النظام، يقول لي بابا لا مستحيل، يعني انتبهي ليكون عم يضحكوا عليكم، مستحيل يكون هالشيء. أنا عم سجله وعم أبكي، بابا سقط النظام، عن جد سقط النظام، نحن رايحين على الشام. فكانت لحظات حلوة.
The dream I had been hearing about from my dad since I was a little girl, the dream of the day Syria is going to be liberated, I got a chance to experience that and see it step by step, moment by moment. As we were heading down south from the north in Idlib, going through the different cities, As we finally knew we were going to enter Damascus, I was recording a voice message from my father. I'm telling him, Assad has fallen, we're going into Damascus. And he was telling me, no, be careful, it's not happening. Just be careful, maybe he's tricking you into some sort of ambush. And I was telling him, no, we're going in. So that was a very emotional moment.
شكراً. أول لحظة عشتها وكانت أحلى لحظة وقت فتح السجون. فتحنا السجون، نحن كنا بإيدنا صحفيين عم نفتح سجون للمعتقلين يلي تغيبوا لسنوات. كانت هاي أحلى اللحظات. بنفس الوقت كنت عم دور على عمي يلي كان معتقل من 2013 لكن مع الأسف ما وصلنا له.
So one of the most beautiful moments were the moment where we reached the prisons. We were trying to open the jails and release the detainees. Even us as journalists, we were opening the doors ourselves to let the detainees out. And these were amazingly beautiful moments to see the detainees walk out. It was very fulfilling, very beautiful, but it was also a bit concerning for me because I was looking for my uncle, who has been detained since 2013 in these prisons, and we were not able to find him, and he was confirmed dead later.
هلا عم نتجول بكل سوريا، بكل محافظة وكل شارع نحن كنا محرومين منه، كل شارع كان بشار الأسد عم يقتل السوريين فيه، بكل مكان كنا نشوف هذا الشيء على الهاتف. عم نشارك الناس فرحتهم بعودتهم لمناطقهم، عودتهم لبيوتهم. بنفس الوقت عم نشاركهم الألم يلي هن عم يحسوا فيه وقت يشوفوا الدمار الكبير يلي صار ببيوتهم، السرقات اللي كتير كانت بتأثر على الناس يلي تعبت سنين لحتى يكون عندها بيت. كمان نحن عم نشاركهم هذا الشيء. إعادة الإعمار بده فترة طويلة كتير لحتى يصير، فنحن اليوم بحاجة إنه نوصل صوت كل السوريين يلي هن بحاجة لنكون نحن والعالم كله معهم.
So after many years of being prevented from moving around in our country and visiting other cities and areas, we today are able to go from north to east, west to south. We can go to all these places that we were only allowed to see through our mobile phones for many, many years. We can go to all neighborhoods, all towns, and share with people their stories. It was also particularly emotional being able to accompany people as they go back to their hometowns, as they go back to their villages and meet the families they have been prevented from seeing for many years, as they go back to looking for their homes. And sometimes there are very sad moments when they arrive and find that their houses have been destroyed and there's nothing left of it. Or when they realize that their houses have been looted and the work they had done for so many years to be able to have a home was just taken away from them for good. For a long time, reconstruction in Syria is going to be needing many years and a lot of work and support. And it is very important for us to be the voices of the people that are working on this and help them as much as we can.
Thank you, Nabieha, for sharing with us this really touching journey. And Nabieha has put together a short video montage of clips that she took during this 2-week period. So we're going to show you that montage now. A video one, please.
رحلتنا بدأت من حلب، تحررت حلب ودخلنا لقلعة حلب.
The journey started from...
بعدين توجهنا لمعركة النعمان، تحررت المعرة بس الدمار كان بكل مكان. هاد بيت بكر مدمر بالكامل بس ما توقفنا. تابعنا الطريق لحماه. بريف حماه أثناء تغطيتنا استهدفتنا طائرات الأسد بشكل مباشر. تحررت حما بس استشهد أنس خربطلي مراسل وكالة الأنباء الألمانية.
أبو جابر، الله أكبر، الله أكبر. أبو جابر.
كملنا وانطلقنا باتجاه حمص عاصمة الثورة السورية. دخلنا حمص، هون سقط الأسد، وأخيراً تحقق الحلم ووصلنا لدمشق. إيه، سقط الأسد وتحررت سوريا وخرجوا كل المعتقلين من ظلام سجون الأسد.
Nabieha, we see you there finally having arrived to Damascus. And you arrived to see the residents of Damascus, but also to experience what would become an influx of international journalists and other investigators that came now finally having access. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
هلا أنا صح كنت بشمال غرب سوريا وحاليا بدمشق. وقت وصلت دمشق تقريبا بعد يوم أو يومين صار في تدفق كبير من الإعلاميين الدوليين والإعلاميين الأجانب والصحفيين. كان عندي شعور مزدوج، من جهة إنه صعب يتم تجاهل، من جهة إنه لازم يتم تسليط الضوء على سوريا عالميا ودوليا. الجهة الثانية إنه شو مشان الصحفيين السوريين اللي قدموا كتير خلال السنوات الماضية.
So as I arrived down from the north of Syria in Idlib to Damascus, when it was liberated, I was in Damascus when a couple of days later international media started arriving to the country from all over the world to cover. And it was a bit of a mixed feeling moment, because on the one hand it is great that, you know, world media is covering our news and is interested and is coming to tell our story. This is very important. On the other hand, I was also concerned for the local journalists, you know, the ones that have been working hard, sacrificing all of these years. They did not stop, they did not give up. And for a moment they were being sidelined.
نحن كصحفيين سوريين بشمال غرب سوريا خاصة اشتغلنا بظروف قاسية، بلا حماية، بلا قوانين بتحمينا. نحن كصحفيين بعضنا استشهد، بعضنا اعتقل. قليل من الصحفيين اللي وصلوا لهذا اليوم. كان في صعوبة كتير كبيرة عم نعيشها. لهيك بحس أنا إنه الشيء اللي نحن أو مساهمتنا اللي عملناها ما تقدرت بشكل كبير من الوكالات العالمية والدولية. لهيك أنا بتأمل بالمرحلة الجديدة لسوريا العالم تعترف بدورنا كصحفيين سوريين، العالم تسمع صوتنا كصحفيين سوريين يلي هذا الصوت ما سكت أبداً خلال 14 سنة.
We have worked in very, very difficult circumstances. We did not have any kind of protection, neither technical nor even legal framework protection. We were not dealt with on fair basis necessarily always by the institutions that we worked with abroad. Many of us were subjected to detention, to torture, to assassination, but we never stopped. We kept going. We never gave up. And I hope that in this new stage that Syria is entering into, local journalists would be better appreciated and work with them would be organized in a better way. We will definitely continue to be the voice of the people, and I think it's very important that we are listened to in that sense.
Thank you. And Hiba, obviously we were amongst that group of international investigators that entered into Syria in the days after the government collapsed. Share with me, your impressions from that period, and share with the audience, what the rationale was for the trip.
Definitely. So, I mean, honestly, that first week was one that oscillated between abject horror and just wild hope and elation. I first arrived and met with one of the journalists that we had worked with for so long in the Northwest. And it was the first time that I got to meet him in person and to see him and to speak to him, and that was an incredible feeling. Activists that we had long worked with, we were also able to meet, so there was that sense of elation at most times. But then at the same time, what we were there for was to kind of witness and see all of the brutality that we had worked on for so long, that we had never thought we'd be able to see in person. We went to Saydnaya, we went to some of the most notorious detention facilities in Syria, to some of the mass grave sites that we had worked on and investigated. And what we saw was heartbreaking, even though we knew, we very well knew just how brutal the Assad government had been. We were still unprepared for what we had seen. In one instance, Lama and I and our colleague Rich, as soon as we arrived, decided to go to the neighborhood of Tadamun in Damascus countryside, where a very horrifying video had come out from 2013. It was an incident that took place in 2013. We had identified the mass grave. My predecessor had worked on a huge report that we never ended up publishing at the time because of security concerns, but we wanted to go and see it in person. And we knew what had happened during that incident. We had verified that. We knew also that beyond the mass execution of 11 men from that particular video, that area was also basically a mass dumping ground for some of the Assad-affiliated militias. But going to the neighborhood, moving through it, going to where that grave was, what we saw there was absolutely horrifying. We saw bones strewn across the streets, in the alleyways. It wasn't that it was all underground, but there were some skeletal remains that were above ground in what was basically a square kilometer area of land. That particular neighborhood is like a microcosm of all of the atrocities that took place over the last 14 years. We could have spent months just investigating and kind of piecing through the events in that particular neighborhood of the entire last 14 years. And we kept going back and we kept speaking to residents, to others who had lived alongside this, very nearby this particular area for so many years, and who were too afraid to speak up at the time, about what it is that they went through. Almost every resident we spoke to had someone who had been disappeared by the militias that were operating in that area. In other places too, in Saydnaya, we saw people camping out, families camping out, hoping against hope that there were still prisoners who had not been freed. There was some irresponsible reporting that I think kind of fed into some of that hope. And here's a point I really want to make, is that there are Syrian activists, Syrian journalists who have worked for so long on this, who themselves have experienced it, and who have intimate knowledge of some of these detention facilities, of some of these prisons. Walking through Saydnaya, having the voice of our Syrian colleague, Shadi Haroun, who works for the collective of former Saydnaya prisoners, had his voice in my head as I was walking around. He knew intimately every corridor, every cell, every area of that prison, had worked on it for so long, and was himself imprisoned there for 10 years. So, lean on the people who know best to be able to report well, because it really does affect the people who are seeking answers, who are desperate for answers. And that's what that first week was. We went to the morgue in Al-Mushtahid hospital in Damascus, where certain corpses had been brought in. People were going in, hurrying, trying to identify their loved ones. These are bodies that had been decomposing for a long time, and people are just rushing through to be able to try and get any sort of answers, any answers at all. So it became very apparent to us very quickly that what we needed to be focusing on in that first week was, advocating for the preservation of evidence. for the securing of these mass grave sites. That really was, and still is, incredibly important and incredibly urgent and very slow moving still at this point. I mean, some of those detention facilities we went to, documents scattered across the ground, hard drives had been stolen, had been lost. There was intentional destruction, intentional burning of a massive amount of documents, and we know that the Assad government had kept a very meticulous record. And so those answers that people are looking for did exist and do still exist. But what we saw was equally heartbreaking in the destruction, the intentional destruction, but also the looting that was taking place, and also some irresponsible journalists and others who were in those areas taking some of those documents away, without preserving what we call the chain of custody, which is what is necessary to be able to then take these perpetrators to court, take these cases to court. It was very chaotic at the beginning. And we made it a point also to meet with the authorities, or the interim authorities at the time, as soon as we could, to impress upon them how important it was, why it was a priority for them as well. Families were waiting for answers, but they were desperate. They'd been waiting for many years. They had paid bribes to be able to get the answers that they wanted. They had sacrificed so much, and they were expecting immediate answers. And I think it was very important, and this is what we made clear to the interim authorities. They needed to communicate to people, to manage their expectations, to explain to them that they too were taking this as importantly as they needed to. We also advocated with UN bodies, institutions, everyone, and it is a massive effort, and everyone needs to be, needs to work together, to cooperate, no duplication of efforts, to make sure that, we are able to truly preserve what exists right now in Syria. And we continue to do that, and I think it is incredibly important, again, to make the point that Syrian civil society needs to be at the center of this, because they know it best. Going through the Air Force Intelligence Branch in Mazze, you would not be able to, even if the documents were not scattered across the floor, to figure out the trail that you needed to follow to find one person. But then having someone who knew this, who had been themselves imprisoned there, who had worked for many years as a researcher, particularly on that branch, to see, what the trail needed to be. You go to this drawer, you pick up the first, arrest warrant, you see what the number corresponding to that is, take that to the other. All of this information that researchers, international researchers might not know and will take years to figure out. Syrian civil society knows this, and they know it intimately, and they need to absolutely be at the center of this.
Thank you, Hiba. I want to save some time for question and answers. I'm going to ask Hadi one final question to you. Of course, we can't take for granted the gains that have been hard-fought and won over the past 14 years. There are significant challenges ahead, but also opportunities, and in particular for transitional justice. Tell us how you see the role of digital documentation in transitional justice, and what steps you think are necessary to ensure that the access that has been gained, continues to be present.
So to be honest with you, one of the biggest challenges right now is, instead of us being focused on figuring out a strategy for long-term transitional justice and advocate for very serious measures practical towards that, our efforts are more directed towards the lift of sanctions. Because it's one of the biggest hurdles to make sure that the government has what it needs in order to work on transitional justice, in order to work on institutional reform, security and basic needs of citizens, and also in order for Syrian civil society to be able to work there and to be able to have the resources to do that. So that's one of the biggest challenges, and as Hiba mentioned, and Nabieha, that we have been doing this for 14 years, and we've acquired so much expertise and so much experience that we would like to make sure that it's used in Syria. And that's related to the work that we have done, for example, with the war crime units in Europe, with accountability mechanisms, such as the International Impartial Mechanism for Syria. And this experience needs to be moved to Syria, and we need to make sure that we don't start from scratch, but we start from this foundation, and we build the skills of also younger generation that is going to be also working on continuing the documentation efforts in many different areas. When I was in Syria, I was in Daraya, and I met young individuals who started their own documentation efforts for information that we haven't seen online and we haven't seen in any other reports, and they would like to continue working on it. So supporting them is very important, and I think this is one of the biggest roles that we should play also as Syrian civil society that has been working outside for a very long time.
Thank you, Hadi. It's critical in hearing from all of you just how important it is to invest in Syrian civil society during this period to ensure that people have access to information, to the answers about the crimes that were perpetrated, and for the perpetrators to be held accountable. We're going to move to the question and answer period. I think there will be somebody in the audience with a mic. I see there's a question up here at the front. Do you want to just ask your question?
In Lebanon, the word Syrian is associated with violence, homelessness, being dirty. What are your perspectives on the treatment of Syrian refugees in the global south and in the Arab world?
Maybe we'll take a couple of questions and then we'll come back to the panelists. Does anybody else want to come in with a question? Over here, please.
Okay, a journalist for human rights, so thank you so much for your input. In particular to you, Nabieha, you said that we will not allow any kind of government to oppress us again the way Assad did. So what would be your major advice for media development organizations operating now in Syria? فنبيها شو هي النصيحة الأهم اللي ممكن تعطيها لمنظمة تطوير إعلامي بدها تشتغل بسوريا أو عم تشتغل بسوريا إذا بتريدي.
Hiba, do you want to start with a question about treatment of Syrian refugees, and then we go to Nabieha?
Definitely. Yeah, so as I had said at the beginning, I mean, the situation for Syrian refugees in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey, also in Europe is something that we had been working on and advocating on for a long time. And you're right, the situation has been quite dismal, both in Lebanon and in Turkey, maybe less so more recently in Jordan, but also there in terms of deportations, in terms of treatment, the lack of integration into societies. There was a sense after the fall of the government, there was a hurry or an acceleration to start, sending people back. Oh, it's time everybody returned. All is good now back there. And even before that, I mean, when I was talking about how bleak the situation was just a month prior to the fall of the government, when the war in Lebanon had erupted and a lot of Syrians were returning to Syria, and you had countries in Europe saying, oh, look, they're going back, it means everything's fine. But no, they were fleeing war and had no other place to go, and were not being accepted into collective shelters, were not being given the aid that others were being afforded in that particular time. I think it's really, really important to keep shedding light on the situation for refugees, because there are new ones now. We've got, after the March 6th violence that took place in the coast, where there were summary executions, looting, destruction of property by government-affiliated armed groups and others. There had been thousands who had again fled Syria to neighboring Lebanon. But right now, we're seeing donor states focusing basically all of the funding and the very little funding, because it's not even enough for Syria and the challenges are massive, but redirecting all of that there and forgetting about the situation in refugee hosting countries. I mean, we just heard recently that the WFP had basically cut all of its programs for refugees in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, and I think Turkey, as a result of the US funding cuts. This is going to be devastating, and it's really important that we keep looking at the situation and keep providing or calling for support for refugees in host countries, because not everyone is going back, and not everyone is going back as soon as everyone's expecting that they would be.
بنصحهم إنه يشوفوا الخبرات الصحفيين السوريين الموجودين ضمن سوريا، ممكن يستفيدوا منها، ومن خلال هدول الصحفيين يفيدوا باقي الصحفيين الموجودين بشمال غرب سوريا.
So I recommend that media development organizations start by looking at the already existing experience and know-how that local Syrian journalists do have, the more experienced ones, and base their programs on that, on expanding that, on helping the more seasoned journalists to develop these projects and to train the younger generation of journalists.
الصحفيين خلال 14 سنة اللي كانوا عايشين بسوريا هن كانوا عم يشتغلوا وعم ينقلوا الحقيقة وعم يوصلوا رسالتهم رغم كل شيء كانوا عايشينه، خاصة بشمال غرب سوريا كان في ضغوطات نفسية، كان في مراقبة، كان في استدعاء للتحقيق طبعا من السلطات الموجودة بشمال غرب سوريا. فرغم هذا الشيء كله الصحفيين السوريين قدروا يورجوا العالم كلها شو عم يصير بسوريا، لو بأدوات بسيطة وبكواليتي بسيط، بس نحن قدرنا نوصل هذا الصوت لكل العالم. وآخر شيء بدي أقول لكم إياه، نحن ما لنا إرهابيين مثل ما كانت السلطات الأسد بتوصفنا، نحن بننتمي للعالم الحر، بننتمي للإنسانية، ورح نبقى هيك، رح نبقى عم نوصل الحقيقة يلي هي لازم توصل للأشخاص يلي ما قدروا يطلعوا ويحكوا فيها. نحن رح نكون صوتهم هلأ وبعدين ولألف سنة قدام.
So the journalists that have been operating in Syria for the past 14 years have overcome incredible hurdles. There were so many different layers and types of pressure that they had to confront. There were psychological pressures, there were legal pressures, there was propaganda pressures, there was shelling, there was starvation, there was detention, there was targeting, and so very, very little resources with which to confront all of this. And yet they were able to continue, they were able to do their job. It wasn't always perfect, it was perhaps a very simple narrative that they were communicating, but still they did manage to get the truth out, and they never stopped doing that. So there is a lot to learn from them, and definitely a lot to work with. In general, the journalists that have been working in Syria, especially in the Northwest, they had been accused for so many years by so many different actors in the world of being terrorists, of being nothing but armed militias against a legitimate government. So I am here to say we are not terrorists. We belong to the free world. We believe in democracy and freedom. We will continue to protect it. We will continue to be the voice of the people from now and for another 1,000 years ahead.
And with that, we will close. Nabieha will allow you to have the final word, helpful word. So thank you for coming here and for sharing your experiences with all of us. Thank you all.